Good evening. As previously mentioned before, we're glad to have y'all come out here, and as Caleb mentioned before, we're very grateful to the elders and John and Jeremy for giving us young men here this incredible example, just this amazing opportunity to learn how to teach people God's Word. And specifically tonight, I want to talk to you guys about Luke 18, 9 through, I believe it is 17, and that is the Pharisee and the tax collector, and that parable that goes along with it. Before we read it, I want to look at the first verse so that we can get some context. The first verse falls in saying, "He also told," that being Jesus, "the parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and they treated others with contempt." Now, looking at the context and why Jesus is going to speak this parable, we can see that from his audience. Looking at it, we see they trusted themselves to be righteous and treated others as lower. They were blind to themselves, trapped in their own bubble of ignorance. They were blinded by their good deeds that they had already done, and they were blinded to the fact of what God could do for them. And we could be the same way today. Think of the plank in your own eye in Matthew 7, 1 through 5, if you want to turn there. It says the following: "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why then do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, and pay no attention to the plank in your own? Or how can you say to a brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck in your brother's eye." So looking at it, the audience that Jesus would have been speaking to, they didn't understand that they couldn't achieve salvation by standing on their own. And Jesus will go through this further to help teach them the way with this parable, which, let's go ahead and read that. We'll read the first part about the Pharisee. "Two men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give tithes to all I get.'" So, looking at the character of the Pharisee, we can very clearly see what Jesus is trying to get across to his audience. The Pharisee is very much a physical manifestation of pride. He's a true garbage of a Christian, you can think about it that way. And here's the scary part. In the Pharisee's prayer to God, he had a relationship with him, and he thought it wasn't all that bad. And from his point of view, he was being grateful, sending thanks to God. But at the same time, he was doing it to be seen by other men, which is a terrible idea. Think about talking to God out of your own ignorance. It's like smacking him right in the face without even thinking about it. And in the end, he walked away with no benefit. And even if he did, if he walked away with anything, it was that his relationship with God had decreased. And throughout the Bible, we can see strong emphasis about the sin of pride. Think Jeremiah 9:23. Let me turn that real quick. It says the following. Oh, my bad. Okay, so it's actually Proverbs 8:13. Which says, let me find it, yep. "To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior, and perverse speech." Now, this is, of course, God talking. And throughout the Bible, hate is a pretty rarely used word. And so we can see the true emphasis that God puts on the idea of pride. And you can also see his attitude towards the Pharisee through this. Now, going back to the parable and reading on about the tax collector, we read the following: "But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift his eyes into heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.'" So, looking at the character of the tax collector, we can see he is a physical manifestation of humility. And if you think about it, this is what Christ came to earth for, this tax collector. Jesus did not come to earth to give a checkup, but to go into major surgery, if you want to think about it that way. There's a quote in my head, I don't know where it came from, but it's been with me, and I think about it almost every day. But the basic idea of it is that the church is supposed to be a hospital, not a museum. And in the same way, we can see this here with Christ was not just going to give a checkup, but he was an EMT almost. You can think about it that way. So, going back to the tax collector, we can see he distanced himself and lowered himself. This shows you that he had a mental sort of manifestation of the guilt that he had experienced. If you think about it, going back to the tax collector idea, they were seen as betrayers to the Jews during that time because they were working with the Romans. So this guilt that he would have had being a betrayer to his own people could have manifested as a mental sort of force keeping him away from the temple and from speaking to God. And even though he overcame that, it took a lot of work. As I mentioned before, he was considered a betrayer, but Jesus loved betrayers, going back to the idea of what Jesus came to earth for. And those who know themselves not to be worthy and still beg for forgiveness are the fruits that Jesus is trying to pick. So looking back to the actions that the tax collector did, he begged for mercy. He probably understood the nature of God even more than the Pharisee. Because, looking back at it, the Pharisee talked very calmly and like a good friend with God. Which, of course, God is the greatest friend that we could ever have. But in a way, the Pharisee sort of downgrades God and underestimates him. The tax collector is basically the exact opposite and in a great contrast to it. He beats his breast, was not even looking into heaven, and bowed his face so low to the ground that he was truly humble. He understood what God could do to save him. And if you think about it, in a way, his eyes were open the entire time. Even though in his position he wouldn't have seen anything being so close to the ground, he saw more than the Pharisee did. And looking at it, he walked away justified. Looking at the end of the passage, we can finish it off. It says, Jesus says, I tell you, the tax collector went to his house justified rather than the Pharisee. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and the one who humbles himself will be exalted. The tax collector walked away a new man. He was surely forgiven, unlike the Pharisee who probably ruined his relationship with God, so to speak. And looking throughout the Bible, we can see so many examples of God loving humility. Think of Proverbs 15:33, if you want to turn there. I'll go ahead and read that. It says the following. Wisdom's instruction is to fear the Lord, and humility comes before honor. And another good passage to look at is 1 Peter 5:5, which says, in the same way, you who are younger, submit yourselves to your elders. All of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud, but shows favor to the humble. That really sticks out, doesn't it? God opposes the proud. If you're prideful, you are basically an enemy of God if you want to think about it that way. So, looking back at it, we can see the obviously intended effect that Jesus wanted to have through this parable to his audience. Going back to them, they treated others as lower because they thought themselves to be righteous. This is arguably worse than the idea of going back to Matthew 7:1-5, of having a stake in your own eye while trying to get a speck out of your brother's eye. If you think about it, it's kind of like a blind person laughing at somebody for wearing glasses, even though they can't really tell if they do or not. So, what does that mean for us? Well, in conclusion, sometimes we can be blinded by pride due to our good works and the way we feel when those are acknowledged, even when staring truth directly in the face or talking with God. In the end, humility is the only way to truly see that we need God. Like the song In Need. Speaking of, there's a passage in that song that I feel connects very well. As I read the following lyrics, I want all of you to think of the image of the tax collector humbling himself to such an extreme before God, praying that he would be saved. In need of things that only you can give to me. In need of Christ, the perfect Lamb, my refuge strong and the great I am. All right, we will now be led in need.